same time as Turreson in Denmark, just right across the sea, was doing similar experiments, and he moved out to California and met up with Klaus and Kecken, or with himself, and Keck and Heisey, who started a series of great experiments in Stanford at the Carnegie Institute. And they collected plants from all across California, and they planted them in common gardens in 3 different locations across California, at Stanford, Mather, and Tenderloin. And they found this great variation of plants just depending on where they were derived from, where they were collected from. And so finding similar patterns to Turreson in California as he had found in Sweden. And so here's their 3 sites, and here's what the plants look like. The coastal plant growing in the same location looks like this. It's a big puffy thing. The inland plant is this tall thing, and the alpine plant is this short little diminutive thing. And they showed this over and over again, just like Turreson. And the way they understood this process better was they actually, instead of just planting them all on one site, they took all of these populations and they planted them to all 3 sites. And so they were able to derive what part of this variation was due to local adaptation. And so when you plant plants into 2 different sites, you get a pattern where plants derived from habitat 1 do well in habitat 1, but in habitat 2 they do poorly, and plants from habitat 2 do well in habitat 2, but do poorly in habitat 1. And so this is what Klaus and Keck and Heisey are most known for, is really getting at these mechanisms of local adaptation. But what's often overlooked is that Clausen wrote a whole book kind of following up on this, on how species might form. And so he came up with this whole idea that speciation happened in stages. And I'm not advocating that this is exactly the way it happens, but I think it's important to look back on the way he thought about it. So he started out with the population, the local population, and then he saw that these things differentiated into ecotypes or ecological races with distinct habitat adaptations with some reproductive isolation, then to what he called ecospecies, which are essentially what we think of as species, where you have some prezygotic isolation and then enough reproductive isolation to keep these things as separate groups. And then into what Turreson also coined xenospecies, which are species complexes where now postzygotic isolation is built up so much that you can only form F1 hybrids between these different groups of organisms. And so reproductive isolation is complete. But I put this asterisk here because they realized that if you doubled the genomes of both of these organisms and made them tetraploid, you could often cross these things as well. And then finally, he had this term comparia to talk about distinct genomes, where these things can no longer form F1 hybrids. I mean, you can take plants from different families and cross them together. As much as you cross them, you'll never form F1 hybrids. And he sort of visualized this whole thing in this kind of wild way. And I really like this drawing where he's got 2 kind of genera of plants out in California, the Mattia and Laia. And these are pretty much separate from each other, and here's all the different species, but he could still sometimes make crosses between these things that he thought of as xenospecies complexes. So after this period of Clausen, this kind of idea of stages and speciation sort of died off, and there's 3 major reasons that I could find why they died off. First of all, the taxonomists really hated the idea. They hated the biological species concept and the idea of these different other forms because they were all based on experimentation, and it kind of went against the whole paradigm. There's a lot of back and forth talk. Some people were nasty with each other. Clemens, who was one of the early experimental taxonomists, was really, really nasty towards the classic taxonomists, and so I think there's some bad blood. It sort of continued on. It's been perpetuated. Even David Baum these days is still publishing papers making claims about this. So also what happened is people conducted a lot of empirical studies that contradicted the results of these separate stages. So for example, Kruckberg did some experiments where he looked at these things called ecological races that Clausen had called ecological races, and he found that there was ecotypes inside these ecological races adapted to serpentine. And he said, what's the point? You can break all these populations down to separate things, so why are you calling these separate groups? And then at the same time, a lot of people were doing experiments out in the Great Plains and other places where there's more continuous variation. They found climal variation. So here's flowering time of, this is actually the plant I'm going to work on for my postdoc, Panicum virgatum, across the Great Plains, all being grown in Austin, Texas. And there's huge, you can't see the numbers, but there's about 15 weeks of difference just between the coast here and the panhandle of Texas in terms of the flowering time. And it was very continuous. So it was like, these aren't really separate distinct groups because they vary along a green